Okay, so this is a busy slide, but it touches on several different topics that we can look at using the intersectional lens. And so I already mentioned colorism, which is something that we'll touch upon more as we cover our topic on race. But here I wanted to show you again the intersections of race and gender. And if you look at the Pew Research analysis on intermarriage rates among newlyweds, what you find is that rates of outmarriage are the highest between whites and Asian Americans or Asians. And what's interesting is if you disaggregate that by gender, you find that the highest rates of outmarriage are between white men and Asian American women. And there are several different gendered racialized stereotypes that partially explain why this may be the case. You look at the data we have on interracial dating, and what you find is that folks who have the highest response rates for women are Asian women. And it also breaks it down as to the preference from men of different racial groups, right? And overall, what you find is that the lowest response rates are for African American women. This includes responses that African American men are seeking, right? So, what you find is that African American men are still seen as a highly desirable group, but not African American women. And so that data sometimes is surprising to many of my students because they say, well, what about Beyonce and Rihanna and all of these folks who are cultural icons? And so, of course, that's something that needs to be analyzed and interpreted more. But part of it is explained by this image that I have of Miley Cyrus with a bunch of African American women performing on stage, doing her cultural appropriation and twerking and all of that, but literally using Black women as props. And I wanted to highlight some of this fetishization, but also dehumanization. And also this idea that you might want to date someone who's a Black woman to live vicariously, but you don't want to invite them home to meet your mom and your family, right? So that's something to be considered as we look at how race and gender intersect, about sexualizing different groups of people. Another theme I wanted to discuss with you has to do with family values. And this is very important in the political rhetoric in our nation because often that rhetoric has real consequences in terms of policies that are made as well as resources that are made available. The family values debate is what has shaped our discourse on welfare and welfare recipients throughout the 1980s under the Reagan administration. This was weaponized against Black women. They were the face of the welfare queen. And the stereotype, which has been shown as mythical by social science in more recent years, was of this Black mom who would have multiple children who would all be welfare dependent, and she's committing welfare fraud, driving a Cadillac, burden on taxpayers, etc. In more recent years, that has been replaced by this idea of an anchor baby, where Latina folks or Latina women are manipulating the system by having these babies, etc. And so it reflects this long, ugly history we have of eugenic thinking in our society. Just very recently, we heard about forced sterilizations that are happening in our detention centers. It's ironic because the poster above shows, it literally says, the most dangerous place for an African American is in the womb. And then you have an image of our president with the saying, every 21 minutes, our next possible leader is aborted. And so these kind of pro-life arguments that are made, um, accusing Black women of aborting these babies, is especially ironic given how much of a catch-22 this is, right? You're doomed if you decide to abort the baby. You're doomed if you decide to have the baby. Meanwhile, you have concentrations of poverty, lack of education, lack of useful sex education, or access to birth control or even basic health care. I'm trying to highlight to you that it is highly racialized, and it is highly racialized for women of color. Right? And then finally, folks like Audre Lorde, piece I had from Kimberly Crenshaw, are highlighting that intersectionality is crucial when you're looking at social movements, such as Black Lives Matter. People keep forgetting queer Black women who started the movement. Same thing with Me Too. Same thing with Stonewall. That's again queer Black women. Too often they don't receive credit for any kinds of progressive movements, reform that we have seen in our society. And also highlighting intersectionality as a way of expressing solidarity, building solidarity between different marginalized groups. And I think that is highlighted by this image that says support immigrant rights in rainbow colors, right? Because indeed, there are folks seeking asylum from persecution just for being who they are as LGBTQI, right? And we have to talk about these issues of misogyny, homophobia, transphobia in our communities of color. We have to talk about domestic violence in our communities of color, right? Without necessarily being seen as a race traitor. Right? And then also very important to understand that as we look at white supremacist movements, or in general, if we are trying to understand a political establishment that openly supports white supremacists and neo-Nazis, sometimes folks are shocked to see the numbers where we see that more than half of college-educated white women in the US supported Trump to be our president, right? After we know about what he thinks about women and how he thinks he can grab them whenever he wants, right? And to be able to understand that, unpack that, we have to look at the intersections of identities, right? To be able to grasp why we have educated folks who are willing to overlook some of these values or lack of values represented in the current administration. And so Audre Lorde is pointing out to us that there's no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives.